Simon Whiteley here. This is hopefully a quick video to talk about one of the 3 case studies that you pointed me to. Essentially what I'm going to do in here is talk about the case study, talk about the application of CAST, and just talk about a few observations that might spawn some ideas. So I'd really appreciate your feedback on it. Right, so let's get this set up. So this particular case study is the Mendon, Missouri train versus a truck accident that occurred on the 27th of June 2022. And the objectives and outline for this video, as always with my videos and my training, is to be friendly and open, to exercise your mind. As the saying goes, minds are like parachutes, they only work if they're open, and of course empower you. So I'm hoping from this sort of presentation today, it'll give you some ideas to apply in the work that you're doing, and it'd be great to hear about that, get some feedback. Now, of course, it's going to provide you some knowledge, and it's going to tweak your mindset a little bit. I'm anticipating, and of course, I intend that this presentation will support your skills development, your personal journey, and then, of course, if you're working as part of your organisation. So the objectives for the presentation is to give you an appreciation for the very basic process of CAST accident analysis. I haven't got the time to go into it in a lot of detail. We're going to go through it very quickly. You'll appreciate how to apply CAST. You'll recognise the significant opportunity that STAMP and CAST present. And to do that, this is the outline. So I'll give you an introduction outline, which is what I'm doing now. I'll prime your mind with some core concepts. We'll talk about CAST accident analysis, give you a brief overview. We'll give you a case study introduction. We'll talk about the losses, the hazards and the high-level safety constraints. We'll talk about the control structure model development, the physical process analysis, the controller analysis, the control structure analysis, and then talk about some conclusions and observations. And of course, at the end, I'll also do a few reflections and ask a few questions, prompt some thoughts in your mind. So just to prime your mind, these are the basics of one of the core concepts of STAMP, which is a control loop. So at the bottom here on the right-hand side, we have a control process, and this could be a physical process or it could be an organisation, something like that, an operational process. We have a what's called a controller, logically, that's in control of that control process, and they influence that control process through some form of control actions, and they receive information about that control process and the effects of their control actions through some form of feedback. And of course, that feedback updates the beliefs of that controller, which again influence the decision making that that controller has, and of course what actions it provides or decides not to provide. Now, I also use the metaphor of a jigsaw puzzle for the control structure model. So when we are thinking about what is the control structure and what it is made up of, we're thinking about these control loops as jigsaw pieces and how they fit together to make that structure. So a quick overview of CAST accident analysis. So CAST, as you're probably already aware, is an acronym, and it stands for Causal Analysis Based on Systems Theory, or depending on which literature you've looked at and the time period within which it was written, it could also be Causal Analysis Based on STAMP. Now, the way I teach all of the STAMP-based processes is around this core concept of 3 phases. And that is what I call the foundation phase. This is where we collect information and prepare ourselves to do a STAMP-based analysis. We look at the losses or unwanted outcomes, accident outcomes, if we're doing an accident analysis. We will then define some related hazards and some high-level safety constraints. And then we'll move into the modelling phase. And this is where we create the control structure model or models, depending how complex the accident is and how many hazards are involved. We may identify some control structure architectural constraints that are relevant. And then, of course, we get into the 3rd phase, which is the analysis phase. And this forecast has ultimately 3 parts. It has the physical process analysis, the controller analysis, and the structure analysis. And this is slightly different to STPA hazard analysis that has 2 parts. The first is the controller control action analysis, and then the second part is the what's called causal scenario or control loop analysis. So this case study then, this is an example of a train versus a truck that occurred in Mendon, Missouri in the United States on the 27th of June 2022. And this case study has been made based on one source of information, and that was the official National Transportation Safety Board NTSB investigation report, which was issued in July 2023 at 16 pages long. And essentially I went through and took it to pieces, reviewed it, thought about what elements of the information available in this investigation report are relevant to a cast stamp-based analysis, and in creating the control structure, and then I essentially summarise that in the presentation that you're about to see. So let's just, there we go, right. So as I said, this is a dump truck that was struck by a train, and this occurred on Monday the 27th of June 2022, 12:42 local time. The weather and environmental conditions, essentially the visibility conditions were daylight, clear, temperature was 81 Fahrenheit, which in European is 27 degrees centigrade, no precipitation, and it involved an Amtrak passenger train number 4, the Southwest Chief, which was travelling from Los Angeles, California to Chicago, Illinois, with 12 crew members and 271 passengers. The dump truck that collided with the train was an MS Contracting LLC company dump truck, which was a 2007 Kenworth, and that was carrying construction aggregate, and it had one driver on board. Now, if you're not familiar with the geography of the United States, Missouri is right slap bang in the middle pretty much, and this occurred on these roads here you can see. So we have the Amtrak train travelling in a west to east direction, sort of southwest to northeast direction, and then the dump truck from a north to south direction. And this is an example of the crossing. You'll notice that the crossing has a very sort of acute angle of 45 degrees. And then this picture on the right hand side is essentially the preceding moments before the train collided with the truck. So the truck was almost across the tracks. You'll also notice that these stop sign and the railroad crossing signs, there are two of those, one on each side. This is what's called a passive crossing. So there are no barriers or gates or flashing lights and bells and things like that. It's just literally two stop signs with a crossing board on it, mounted at each side of the railway. Now this is a picture taken from the official investigation report that just gives a representative perspective of the view of the truck driver, essentially looking over their left shoulder, with the truck B-pillar, trying to look across the track and identify an oncoming train. Now it's important to understand, and I'll just zoom in a little bit further so you can see better. The distance that train is from the crossing point is about 400 metres, quarter of a mile. And this particular train was travelling at just about 90 miles an hour, which is approximately 40 metres per second. So the distance from where that train is at the moment to the crossing is about 10 seconds. So there's not really much time to sort of acquire and make decisions about travelling across the crossing. And then this is the aftermath, the accident scene and damage. So on the left-hand side, you can see the derailed train with 8 rail cars and 2 locomotives, and then the damage to the front of the locomotive itself from the collision. Now let's talk about the losses. So when we're doing any kind of accident investigation using STAMP, using CAST, we have to think about, well, what are the actual outcomes that we are concerned with? And also be mindful that there may be other potential outcomes that didn't occur on this occasion, such as a near miss, but could have been very serious, and we can use CAST to investigate those near misses and get some really interesting results. But in this particular case, the Amtrak passenger train number 4 derailed. Unfortunately, there were 3 fatalities, all passengers, and also 146 people injured. The MS Contracting LLC dump truck was completely destroyed, and unfortunately the driver also lost their life. In terms of track and equipment damage, it was about $4 million. And then, of course, the associated service disruption and recovery operations that were necessary. So if we think about it through the lens of STAMP, I've just listed there 4 basic losses: death and injury, property damage, destruction, service disruption, and then the potential for environmental damage or destruction. So, if fuel was spilled or other hazardous materials were put into the environment, or there was damage to the environment itself physically. So this is the timeline sequence of events. It's a bit small, so I'll just make it bigger on the screen. Essentially, train number 4 departed Los Angeles, California previously, and a new crew boarded at Kansas City. And then at 9 a.m. on the 27th, the Monday morning, train number 4 departed Kansas City, Missouri, but it was 1.5 hours behind schedule for various unclear reasons. I don't know what the reasons were for that. Now, the dump truck itself had made 2 previous trips across the crossing. I understand that there were actually 2 dump trucks, and they were working together, those drivers, and they were delivering construction aggregate from a quarry in Huntsville, Missouri, to sites near the Garden of Eden levee system on the Missouri River. And both drivers had previously stopped for lunch in Brunswick, Missouri, before continuing to go to the crossing and then to attempt to cross. Now at 12:42 and 36 seconds, so that same day, the train engineer, the train driver, sounded the locomotive horn near the whistle board, which is approximately 1,300 feet, about 404 metres, quarter of a mile west of the crossing. And then a matter of seconds later, the train engineer saw a truck approaching the crossing from the south. The train engineer sounded the horn 4 times over the next 10 seconds, and the train was approaching the crossing at 89 miles per hour, as I mentioned before, about 40 metres per second. So it covers that quarter of a mile in about 10 seconds. And at this time, the truck was moving at about 5 to 6 miles an hour as it approached, and then began moving across the crossing without stopping. And then at 12:42:44 seconds, so 8 seconds later, the train engineer initiated emergency braking application, which is air brakes, and the train decelerated to 87 miles an hour before striking the truck. And that occurred at 12:42 and 46 seconds, and that's when the collision and derailment began. Now, when the train collided with the truck's left rear sidewall panel, that caused the truck to spin round counterclockwise, anti-clockwise, separating the cab and dump bed from the chassis. Now, the collision damage to the lead locomotives covered the left front bulkhead, and you saw that in the photo I showed in a few moments ago. And the train continued moving east after the collision, and the front of the lead locomotive came to rest nearly 1,300 feet or almost 400 metres east of the crossing. So you can imagine the amount of energy in this train moving at almost 90 miles an hour. Now, both locomotives and 8 rail cars derailed, with 7 rail cars overturning and coming to rest on their right sides. And unfortunately, when those passenger rail cars overturned, unfortunately, people were seriously injured, and there were a number of fatalities. At 12:45, the emergency responders were notified, and then at 13:02, so almost 15 minutes after the collision, the emergency responders arrived on scene. Now, there are some other key events that occurred pre the accident and post the accident, and that relates to a previous similar accident that occurred on the 25th of September 2022, so say 9 months prior to this one. And then post-accident, after the NTSB begun its investigation and the Missouri State Highway Patrol did their investigations and interviewed people, the investigation report was issued in July 2023, so about 11-12 months after the accident itself. And interestingly, in July 2023, the Missouri State budget included $50 million for improving grade crossing safety. So that's a positive outcome, if that's appropriate to say. Now, in terms of hazards and high-level safety constraints, the hazard that is stated in the NTSB report, and I don't know if this is a standard railway term or where it originates from, but that is a hazard in this context is called fouling, a person or object being in proximity to a track such that they could be struck by a moving train. Now, just to sort of emphasize that from a system safety engineering perspective and the definitions that are used as part of safety assessments that are not STAMP, and then contrasting that with STAMP and the definitions used in STAMP, that is very much about the potential for harm to occur. But when we're talking about hazards using square brackets, the definition within STAMP, we're talking about a system state or event that that will lead to a loss. It is sort of inevitable. It's not a potential. It is, if this system state or event occurs, a loss will result. So it's very much more specific. So I've formulated that a person or object in proximity to a track such that they would be struck by a moving train. So it's more sort of definite. Now, there are also a couple of other sort of sub-hazards or related hazard to this, which I'm not going to go into detail in this case study today, but just give you a bit of food for thought. So hazard 2, inadequate separation between people or objects and moving trains. So we're focusing there on about the adequacy of separation. And then number 3, train movement when the track is obstructed. So this hazard is related to train movement and by implication who has control and influence over that. And then of course number 4, track is obstructed or not clear. So again, who has responsibility for dealing with or managing that hazard or preventing it or responding to it should it occur? And how does that stakeholder communicate with the other stakeholders responsible for those other hazards? Now, in the broadest sense for hazard 1, there are 2 very broad high-level safety constraints. The first one is the control structure shall control people and or objects such that they cannot be in proximity to a track when a train is moving or is to be moved, such that they can be struck. So that's about people and objects and control of those. And then high-level safety constraint 2 is about the control structure shall control the movement of a train such that people and or objects in proximity to a track cannot be struck. So again, I'm just emphasizing this is about who or what is responsible for enforcing the safety constraints, mitigating the hazards. So let's talk about the control structure model development now. So starting with the physical process, that's where we usually start building control structure models. What is the physical situation? Where is the energy transferred? Well, in this case, it's about the movement of the dump truck and the movement of the passenger train and them coming into conflict and having a collision. Then we think about, well, who or what is directly in control of those control processes. So in this case, we've got the truck driver and the train driver or engineer. And then who else is logically in control of that truck driver, train engineer, and the movement of their respective vehicles? Well, logically, there is some kind of operational leadership. So I've just included some very generic labels there to sort of get the creative juices flowing. Now, of course, they all have some form of hierarchy, some form of interactions, so control actions and some form of feedback. But it's important to think about these control structures in the context of those high-level safety constraints. So as you can see, just to sort of emphasize this point, the high-level safety constraint 01 is about the control of people and or objects. So in this context, we're talking about the control of the dump truck's movement and the decisions to make it move across the railway. And then on the right-hand side, we've got the concept of control the movement of the train. So again, that's what this control structure looks at. Now, it's important to be mindful that these two structures, they interact with each other. And those interactions actually help to maintain safety or actually degrade things such that accidents can occur. So in this case, we've got the visual feedback from the dump truck all the way up to the train driver. So the train driver is looking out the cab and they can see the railway ahead and things going on. And then the other, from a truck driver context perspective, we've got some visual feedback about the train, but you've already sort of seen that it was quite difficult for the truck driver to be able to see the oncoming train given the distances involved and the geometry of the road and the track and also the truck itself. But also you've got some conceptual control actions, which I've put some speech marks on there just to emphasize that the train driver can, pull the horn and make a lot of noise and maybe flash some lights. But are they really conceptually control actions for the truck driver, or are they just feedback? Are they just, interactions not necessarily control interactions. So just have a think about that when you're modeling your control structures and thinking about, well, what is a control action? What is a feedback? What's the difference? It could just be information, not necessarily a control action. And then thinking about, well, what must the decision making and mental model be of the train driver, the engineer? Had they provided any contributory control actions that led to this particular outcome? Or, did they follow the instructions and procedures and do everything they should have done, but unfortunately it resulted in an accident? And then again, think about, well, what are the other interactions or influences upon that particular controller? In the case of the train driver, they went past the whistle board 1,400 feet approximately from the crossing point, which requires them to, use the horn. Now, I'm not going to go into detail in all of these interactions now. We're going to go into that in later on, but I'm just starting to get your sort of mind going about the concept of control structures and how to do the modelling and the type of questions and decisions you might want to make. So let's think about the truck driver now. So what must their beliefs have been? What must their mental model be about the state of the truck, about the state of the railway, and how did that influence their decision making and the contributory control actions that they made? What about the crossbuck and stop signs? How does that influence their decisions? What about the design of the railroad crossing itself? How does that influence the dump truck physically, the physical process of a big heavy truck? And then also, what about the influence on the truck driver in their decision making? Now, of course, it's not really clear from the investigation report who's actually responsible for the design of the crossing and whether it complies with standards and things. So I've included, as you can see in the top right hand corner there, I've just included a controller to represent the railway design, build maintenance and change organisation, because it's not really clear to me, and not being American, I don't quite understand some of the names and labels that are used in the investigation report. And then MS Contracting LLC, so the organisation that operates the trucks, what control actions did they provide or not provide? What were their mental models and decision-making control algorithms? Did they identify the potential risks associated with crossing with this particular crossing? Did they provide any instructions or other risk management aspects? And then, of course, going even more detailed about the railway, the train itself and the railway operating companies. In the investigation report, it highlights that Amtrak is the sort of operator of the train, and it also mentions BNSF Railway Company, but it's not clear to me from the investigation report how that sort of fits into things. So that's why I've added those dotted lines and purple question marks. But I've also included a little bit about the detail. I'll just zoom in a little bit so you can see. So I've included the BNSF train dispatcher, because they are in some level of influence or control over the movement of the train. So, for example, why was the train delayed setting off? Was that due to BNSF train dispatcher issues, or was it to do with the train or the decisions of the train driver, the engineer? And what about the positive train control system and the application of speed and brakes? Well, we know from the investigation report that's not relevant in this particular accident, but I'm just including it here just to sort of give you some ideas that, once you create a control structure like this for certain scenarios, they can be reused for other investigations that you're performing and speed up your performance of the investigations. I've also highlighted here, just for the narrative, the event data onboard image recorder and the fact that they're collecting information about the train and also the outside environment of the train. And the importance of that for investigations, because if that is not prioritised as being fully functional and available, and that the data is collected as soon as possible after the incident so it doesn't get overwritten, I can't sort of underplay how important that is, and that we need to keep hold of it. Okay, so adding extra detail now, let's talk about federal regulations very quickly. So we know that there are some railway crossing design standards, so I've included that, but it's not clear to me from the investigation why those railway crossing design standards were not applied to this particular crossing, and whether the various operating companies realised that and changed the way that they operate their vehicles, their trains. So there is automotive or railroad crossings at grade, CFR 49. And then there are also a few others about railway speeds, usage of horns, and then also there's this particular CFR regulation, which I'll talk about in a bit more detail later on, but that sort of raised a few questions in my mind. It's a little bit strange. It includes a bit of a contradictory statement, but we'll come back to that. And then, of course, other organisations that are mentioned in the official investigation report, but it's not really clear how they fit into the control structure model and influence the various aspects of it, and whether or not they had any contributory control actions. So there's the US Department of Transportation, the Federal Railroad Administration, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and then, of course, the US government and Canadian government. They were mentioned sort of in passing, and I think the Canadian government is more related to BNSF than the US government. But anyway, that sort of shows my level of understanding and knowledge of this particular industry and case study. So moving on. So yeah, that's the full screen. It looks really, really small, so I'll just make it big again. And that just sort of gives you an idea that, you know, as we've been building this control structure and all the use of the different colours and dotted arrows and things like that, I've built it up in this way just so that I can present and narrate over the top of it. You don't have to do it like this. I'm just showing you one way to go about it. Let's talk about the analysis phase. So as I mentioned, there's three basic parts to cast accident analysis phase: the physical process analysis, the controller analysis, and the control structure analysis. Now, I'm not here to say that it is sequential or parallel. It depends on the investigation that you're performing and the availability of information, and of course your control structure model and how you develop it. But these are three broad sort of areas of analysis. Now, when we're talking about the physical process analysis, this is where we are talking about the physical components, the process, the physical process, and controls, physical actuators, sensors, things like that, directly related to that physical process. We're not actually talking about people or control systems at this stage. They will be considered as part of the controller analysis and the structure analysis. So essentially what we do is we list the physical equipment, the process and controls. We look at the roles and responsibilities that relate to safety, relate to those hazards, you know, hazard mitigations and safety requirements and constraints, whether there were any physical failures or not, whether there were any contributory control actions or interactions we need to think about. And then we look at why and how, or reasons why, or explanations why they contributed or not. And then identify any missing or any flaws or inadequacies. And then, of course, highlight any relevant context or contextual factors. Then we summarise the role of that physical component in the accident and capture any questions or recommendations. Now, in this particular case, the truck itself, there were no failures or issues reported with the truck, its systems or performance. The point of impact was on the truck left rear sidewall panel. The collision itself spun the truck counterclockwise and separated the cab and dump bed from the chassis. It was a manual gearbox truck, and it was being driven up a 10.8% grade incline, which was a significant incline. The train itself, again, same thing, no failures or issues reported with the train, systems or performance. Now, it's important to appreciate that for this particular case study, I've not really looked at aspects related to the post-collision performance, crash integrity or occupant safety at this time, because there isn't really enough detail in the investigation report and I haven't had the time to dig into that. And in terms of the control structure model for crashworthiness, if I was to include that in this case study, I would include a separate, distinct control structure for that particular topic. But because this investigation report didn't have much, if any, detail on that, I just couldn't put that type of control structure together. But as I mentioned earlier on, there was a previous accident nine or so months prior to this one, and the investigation report for that particular accident I think is available and has a significant more amount of information in it. So when I look at that particular case study, I might come back and update this case study. The train horn, that was compliant with federal regulations. Collision damage to the lead locomotive's left front end. The train continued moving east after the collision, and the front of the lead locomotive came to rest nearly 1,300 feet east of the crossing. Both locomotives and 8 rail cars derailed, with 7 rail cars overturning and coming to rest on their right-hand side. Now, in terms of track infrastructure, there were no failures or issues reported. However, there were trees growing adjacent to the whistle board, which may have obscured the moving train and hindered the truck driver's ability to see the oncoming train and estimate whether they should go or not. Now, in terms of the road crossing infrastructure, this is where it gets interesting. So the crossing itself was a passive crossing, which was equipped with crossbucks and stop signs, as you can see just over the right-hand side there. It was not an active crossing, so it didn't have any active warnings, flashing lights, signals, barriers or gates. And it did have a 45-degree crossing angle, which, again, I've already said this, may influence the truck driver's visibility. There was a significant incline grade measured from 30 feet or 9 metres from the near side rail, and that was 39 inches, almost a metre drop. So that's quite a significant grade of 10.8%. Now, the crossing itself did not apparently meet known standards, and it wasn't clear from the investigation report why that was. It was relatively unexplained. I don't know why that was. But it highlighted that the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, the AASHTO, recommends that highway surface near a crossing not slope down more than 3 inches as measured at 30 feet, 9 metres from the near side rail. So 3 inches, 8 centimetre drop, which is a 0.83% grade, which is, this particular crossing is 13 times more than that maximum recommended by AHSHTO. So just to give you an idea of how steep it was. Now, the truck drivers normally slowed down or stopped on the level part of the grade, which was 152 feet or about 46 metres from the near side rail. So this was 3 times the distance Missouri law requires vehicles to stop, which is within 15 to 50 feet, 4.5 to 15 metres of the nearest rail. And there were potholes and humps on the gravel road surface on the approach to the crossing. And the gravel on the grade near the crossing was referred to as spongy by one of the witness drivers. And that caused the trucks to bounce around, prompting drivers not to stop on the sloped grade near the crossing because of the difficulty of accelerating afterwards. And instead, drivers would slow down or stop on the flat portion of the grade, which of course influenced the train visibility and timing of truck movement. So just straight away there's a bit of a question there for the railway crossing responsible party. I'm not sure who that is because it's not clear. And just to emphasise the point, when you're going through the process of building the control structure model, that activity helps to drive out the questions about, well, who should we involve in the investigation? Who do we need to ask questions of? So in this case, whoever the railway crossing responsible party is, how was the road crossing infrastructure allowed to be in the state it was? And how was this communicated to other stakeholders such that they could consider putting other controls in place? And now for the control analysis phase. So the control analysis, component analysis of the control structure, essentially looks at the requirements and control actions, then the how and why, the reasons, the explanation, and then the summary of the role of that component, that controller in the accident, and then of course any questions and recommendations. And this is essentially focusing on that control loop, the jigsaw piece of the control structure, the jigsaw puzzle. And it's important to recognise that we're looking for, because we're doing an investigation of an accident, we're looking for contributory control actions, which are logically the same as unsafe control actions, the term used in STPA hazard analysis. But of course, we have to be mindful that we're not subject to hindsight bias. It's not appropriate to refer to, the driver of the truck, driving the truck over the tracks as an unsafe control action, because they may have believed that the track was clear and it was safe to go. We can't know that for certain because obviously we can't ask them because they have died, but it's important to be respectful but also avoid hindsight bias. The action of driving across the crossing will be referred to as a contributory control action, because we don't know the context within which the decisions were made to go. They may have had real genuine reasons to believe it was safe, and it's wholly inappropriate to apply hindsight bias and blame human error, things like that. So moving on, so there are 6 elements I've looked at as part of this case study. I couldn't go any further than this because there wasn't enough information in the investigation report, but I'm just hoping that as we go through this, it'll start to dawn on you that actually the approach of using STAMP, using cast accident analysis, really opens up so much more for you to consider to really get to the crux of what actually has happened, and more importantly, how to prevent it in the future. So first we're going to talk about the train driver, the engineer. So this is the control structure model for the train driver engineer. All I've done here is highlight the locomotive horn, as you can see there, and the emergency braking control actions. They are not what you would call contributory control actions because they didn't directly lead to the collision. The driver did the best that they could, given the physics of the situation, a massive train moving at 90 miles an hour with 400 meters to detect a problem and respond to it. For this type of crossing, they were always going to have a crash no matter what happened. That design of the crossing with that arrangement was going to lead to an accident. Now, they did provide some horn blasts, which I've highlighted here in red as control actions. I'm not sure whether it's appropriate to refer to those as control actions because it's not as if the train driver has any authority over the truck driver. It's literally just horn blasts and maybe flashing some lights. I don't know the details. So what made sense, when we're talking about the mental model, the beliefs of that train driver, their mental model will have been updated. Hey, there's a truck about to, it is crossing the train, crossing the tracks. I need to take some actions. And they took appropriate actions. So let's talk about the safety requirements and control actions then. So what safety related roles and responsibilities does this controller have in the control structure? So they control the train movement within limits and procedures. They monitor for potential train issues. They monitor for potential track obstructions, which is very relevant to this particular situation. And then they stop train movement when the train is obstructed, which is what the train driver attempted to do. Now, in terms of contributory control in terms of control and feedback ability, there was no evidence that there were any issues with the ability of that controller to either receive feedback or provide control actions or any failures related to that. In terms of contributory control actions, as I've said, strictly there were none. They did what they were supposed to do. Unfortunately, it resulted in an accident. Now, in terms of why and how, reasons and explanations, given that this controller did not strictly provide any contributory control actions, this has not been explored further or included as part of this case study. And also because the investigation report does not consider it, nor would it normally be expected to do because it was successful. So if you're talking about work as done, work as as imagined, I don't know if there's a lost opportunity there to go and talk to the train driver. What could you have possibly done else to avoid this situation or improve it? And perhaps the feedback might be, well, we could have been driving slower, and that question then could be explored as part of the cast accident analysis. So I'm not going to look at decision making or actions and behaviours. I'm not going to look at beliefs, mental models, process models. I'm not going to look at context or contextual factors. So the summary role of that controller in the accident: this specific controller performed as required, but unfortunately that was a dangerous success. So questions and recommendations. So specifically for this part of the control structure, why was the high-level safety constraint O2 not enforced? The control structure shall control the movement of a train such that people and or objects in proximity to a track cannot be struck. Well, that sort of leads into, well, from a train operator perspective, a question for them is, given the railway crossing design state, why was the train permitted to move at 90 miles per hour and not a speed with sufficient time to stop should the crossing become obstructed? Did the train operator identify this risk? That's an avenue for inquiry. What was the mental model, the beliefs of the operator about this particular situation? And then again, questions for the railway crossing responsible party. I'm not identified who that is yet. Why was the railway crossing design state such that trains moving at 90 miles per hour permitted? So if they knew that the train crossing was a passive crossing and that it had a really steep grade and that trucks were going to travel across it, why didn't they do anything about it? Did they know that that was an issue? Did they recognise that? What was their beliefs? What was their mental models? And of course, what coordination took place between the railway crossing responsible party and the train operator? Did they tell the operator, hey, just be aware this particular crossing is going to be used by trucks and it's got a significant grade, so you're going to have to slow down? What are the avenues for inquiries there? Now let's talk about the truck driver controller. So here is the control structure I made earlier. And as you can see, I've added some interactions and some colours just to sort of emphasise this and allow me to narrate over the top. So the truck driver has some decision making. They do make some decisions about certain things, such as, is it safe to cross? How is the vehicle going to perform? Let's go. They'll have some beliefs about their vehicle, about the state of the railway and whether there's a train coming or not, or whether there is enough time to cross if they know there's a train there. They will receive feedback from their truck about its performance, especially on an incline, and that it's a manual gearbox and all of that good stuff. And then, of course, they'll have visual feedback, or will they have visual feedback? There's an assumption by that orange dotted line that they have feedback available to them, but did they actually have feedback? Did they actually see the train and know it was there? Did they even look for the train? We don't know that for certain. We can't be certain about that. We can't just assume they didn't look or they did see it and just went anyway. We can't. It's unknowable. And then, as I mentioned, the control actions from the train driver earlier on. So the horn blasts. Did the driver even hear the horn, or did they hear the horn and unfortunately they knew the train was coming and they couldn't get across in time? And then, of course, the contributory control actions. So these are the actions of driving the truck across the crossing. They don't, like I mentioned earlier on, we can't say that they're unsafe control actions because that's not appropriate. We need to be mindful of that hindsight bias. And then, of course, the highway railroad grade crossing. That obviously influenced the dump truck, but how did it influence the driver in their decision making? And then, of course, the crossbucks and stop signs. There's no indication from this sign that you've got massive trains flashing past at 90 miles an hour. There's no indication that you've got 10 seconds from first visually acquiring the train coming at you for it to it being where you are physically present. There's no indication of that. So, the beliefs of the truck driver, there are some potential issues here with the way the railway is designed and the information provided to the truck driver to aid their decision making. So moving on then, so let's have a look at the safety related roles and responsibilities. So the truck driver has to control truck movement within limits and procedures. They have to monitor for potential truck issues, monitor for oncoming trains, do not move the truck across the tracks when a train is coming, and do not obstruct the track. Now, you could argue there's a couple of other responsibilities related to if they get breakdown on the track. They have to get in touch with the railway signallers. I can't remember the term used on American railways, but the people who control the red lights. Maybe even talk to the train driver themselves. Hey, my truck has broken down on the crossing. Please slow down or stop. There's no information in the investigation report about that because obviously it's not relevant to this accident. But what I'm saying is this method of looking at the control structure and exploring the responsibilities and the process model and control algorithm of the driver can highlight other causes of other accidents which we might want to do something about, perhaps. In terms of control and feedback ability, actuators and sensors, whether there were any failures, there were no issues reported, and of course some of that is unknowable because we can't speak to the deceased person. And there was a toxicology toxicological test that did not indicate the driver was impaired. So that's a good piece of evidence, good piece of information. Now, in terms of contributory control interactions, I've highlighted logically two. The first is the truck driver drove the truck across the crossing when a train was moving to cross the crossing. And that relates to hazard 1, of course. And then contributory control action number 2, the truck driver did not stop the truck at the stop sign prior to crossing the track. And we're going to explore why that is in a moment. So let's talk about why, how, reasons, explanation. Now, as I mentioned, given the truck driver was killed, it's impossible to know for certain the reasons for their actions. Consequently, the following is based on the Missouri State Highway Patrol interview with the witness truck driver from the same company. So this driver had a driver behind them in a truck that witnessed the whole thing, and based on the information that they provided to the Highway Patrol, that's what's influenced what I've written here. So decision making, actions and behaviours. So the truck driver needs to move the truck when the track is clear and no train is coming, or they move the truck if there is enough time for their truck to clear the crossing before the train arrives. Now, I recognise that second decision might be somewhat controversial, because on one part of the house we might say, well, if there's a train, they should not attempt to cross at all, no matter what, because it's a high-speed train doing 90 miles an hour. Or it could be that the truck driver is trying to be efficient with their time and trying to cross the crossing. So they may believe genuinely that they have time to make a crossing, and not appreciate how fast a 90 miles per hour train can cover 400 meters. So there's sort of a bit of an interesting conversation to be had there. Now, in terms of beliefs, mental model, process model, flaws and inadequacies, quite clearly there's a few here that are critical to this particular accident. So the first is they may have believed the track was clear and that no train was coming. And this is especially since this particular train was scheduled to have already passed through this section 1.5 hours before, but was delayed setting off. Now, this particular topic is not discussed in the investigation report, and I'm highlighting it because it's mentioned in the timeline. The train was delayed 1.5 hours. So is it possible, and I don't know because it's not in the investigation report, but is it possible the train driver had a schedule of train times and was using that to influence their decision about when they went to cross the track? Because they may have thought, if the train's already gone past, we've got a good time window to make the crossing and not be putting ourselves at unnecessary risk. But if they then don't know that the train's been delayed and it's coming, it's unexpected, that could be an element. Now, I'm just emphasising that because when we think about, what must the beliefs be of this truck driver that might explain the control actions it provided, that's something that we might want to think about. Are there any other beliefs that are reasonable that this truck driver had? Another one, they may have believed there was enough time for their truck to clear the crossing before the train arrives. They may have believed that the steep grade made stopping truck movement at the crossing as required by state law and then starting again difficult. Arguably, this might also be considered unsafe in certain conditions. E.g., they might, if they do what the state law requires, they might skid onto the crossing and not be able to get the truck moving again. Now, I'm postulating that as to be open, but when we're exploring things through this concept of beliefs and mental models, we've got to be open to all possibilities. And the other thing to emphasise is if this approach, the control loop, controller, the process, the control actions, feedback, mental model, beliefs, process model, and then control algorithm and decision making. If we use that model to perform our interviews with witnesses, that might help us to uncover some of these beliefs, mental models that it's not obvious from the outset. So contextual factors, well, the truck cab, the B-pillar affecting truck driver vision, the road incline, the rough ground, the track viewing angle and or vegetation obscuring the approaching train, the truck performance and its manual gearbox, And and of course the truck driver was not using a cell phone at the time, so we can eliminate that from the investigation. Now, it's important to recognise that STAMP empowers the analyst to postulate many causes, contributors of accidents, but it is important to only focus on those that are supported by the evidence. So we could get distracted as analysts by all these weird and wonderful ideas and possibilities, but if they're not supported by the evidence or are unknowable, unobservable, we have to be mindful that we're not, playing hindsight bias. We are assuming that these things have happened because they explain the behaviour of a particular controller. We have to be really vigilant about that. And as I said, CAST focuses on contributory control actions and causal scenarios for this specific accident. But when we're thinking about things through the lens of STPA, that empowers consideration of many other causes, not just for this specific accident, but also other future or similar accidents that have occurred. Okay, so in summary, the role of this controller in this accident, this particular controller provided a contributory control action that directly resulted in the collision, the occurrence of hazard 1. So again, questions and recommendations. Why was the high-level safety constraint 1 not enforced? Why did the control structure not control people and or objects such that they cannot be in proximity to a truck when to a track when a train is moving, is to be moved such that they can be struck? So there's questions for the truck driver there, or the operator of a truck. Given the railway crossing design state and that it carries trains moving at 90 miles an hour, why did the truck driver use the crossing? Did the truck driver identify the risk? Did they have any influence over the decision making of which crossings they were going to use? So I suppose that's a question for the truck driver and the operator of the trucks. Then we've got the railway crossing responsible party again. Why was the railway crossing design state such that road vehicles and especially trucks were permitted to use the crossing? And what coordination took place between the railway crossing responsible party and the truck driver? Why were the crossbucks and stop signs considered adequate for this kind of crossing? What information regarding the movement speed of trains, time available to cross, was not present? I think I've already mentioned that. Would it help to tell drivers, hey, this particular crossing has 90-mile-an-hour trains, so no matter what, if you see it, you're not going to beat it across the crossing, so don't even try? I mean, that might be a bit... obviously I don't work in the railway industry, so that might be a bit of a silly thing to say, but I hope you're getting the point that I'm trying to put across. So there's a potential recommendation there. Consider upgrading this crossing to an active crossing standard or convert the crossing into a bridge under over. Now, I understand from the report that $50 million was made available by the Missouri state to actually address some of these crossings across the state. I think they've got something like 1,800 passive crossings or something crazy like that. So they have a lot of these crossings all over the place. And so whoever's responsible for allocating that funding and using that funding, they should consider this. And I think they have, actually. Looking at the satellite photos, I think they've made it into a tunnel. I'm not sure. Don't quote me on that. Okay, so moving on then. Now let's talk about the Truck Movement Operational Leadership, MS Contracting LLC. So again, I've just expanded the control structure to highlight MS Contracting LLC, their decision making, their beliefs, what contributory control actions, if any, they provided, and some purple dotted lines, question marks, just to emphasise we don't really know too much because the investigation report doesn't talk about it. But by going through the CAST analysis process, we might uncover some important questions that we might want to ask if we were doing the investigation or doing a similar investigation. So, for example, what are the requirements and control actions? What are the safety-related roles and responsibilities of this particular controller? Well, we could argue that, one of their responsibilities is to control truck movement by providing the truck driver with appropriate limits and procedures. They monitor and resolve potential truck or driver performance issues. They do not allow the truck to obstruct the track. Now, that's an implied responsibility, and there are many of those, not explicit. So in terms of control and feedback ability, There was no issues reported, but again, it's not clear from the investigation report whether they considered this, or they did, but they just didn't find anything worth writing about in the official investigation report. In terms of contributory control actions, again, no issues reported in the official investigation. But again, I wouldn't expect that because, I wouldn't expect the investigation to consider that, given they haven't used stamp cast accident analysis. So I've postulated a contributory control action, and that is that the truck movement operational leadership, so I'll just highlight that, presumably planned that the truck would use this specific railway crossing when the route between work sites presented challenging operating conditions. Now, you could say, well, that's hindsight bias, Simon. You're assuming that they've done that. No, all I'm doing is highlighting that a movement operational leadership, somebody or an organisation that is responsible for instructing and tasking those movements to take place, they have a duty of care to do some kind of safety or risk assessment to make sure that the task that they are allocating is not going to result in an accident. And I accept that this is probably a small organisation and they don't have large resources to map out every single truck mission that they're going to perform. But there is an implied responsibility to do that, whether it's the driver doing it themselves or whether it's their leadership that's doing it. There has to be some form of risk assessment, especially for commercial operations. So that's why I've included it. And if there's not, there's a recommendation there. Any businesses that are going to be moving vehicles across crossings should do a crossing risk assessment, and perhaps the railway operator or the railroad operator who looks after the crossings, perhaps they should be involved in leading that activity because it's their railway. So moving on, what reasons, why, how, reasons, explanation for these contributory control actions that I've postulated. Now again, given the truck driver was killed, it's impossible to know for certain the reasons for their actions or the control actions feedback between them and the truck movement operational leadership. So we can't know that, and the official investigation doesn't include any information about the discussions they had with the MS Contracting LLC. I certainly think that is, if we were going to do this investigation again in the future, we would ask questions of that. What was the operational leadership doing or didn't do, and how did that contribute? So consequently, this cannot be commented upon other than to observe that, had the investigators used stamp cast to steer their investigation, they could have explored much further and potentially made more specific recommendations to prevent this type of accident in future, such as exploring any risk management actions that look at the conduct of the truck movements across the railway crossings and how they coordinate with the railway train operators. Potential recommendation: to support an accident incident investigation, large vehicles used in proximity to or that cross railway crossings should be fitted with crash protected onboard data video audio recorders. Now, of course, that's a bit of a controversial topic, and I appreciate that. But for certain types of operations, perhaps that is something that should be recommended or mandated. Or for certain crossings, perhaps there should be other stakeholders involved to manage the safe crossing of those crossings. Another potential recommendation is the truck operators to coordinate truck movements with the railway or train operators. And again, I've not gone into the detail of decision making because there's not enough information to talk about. But I'm hoping you can see that following this process of what is the control loop, who's the controller, where does it fit in the control structure, what are the interactions, that method of exploration can help you ask some very powerful questions. So to summarise then, there were no issues reported, or at least it's not clear the investigation considered this. This controller presumably provided a contributory control action that led to the truck driver using this crossing which indirectly or directly resulted in the collision. So there is a question there. So some other questions, again, why was high-level safety constraint 01 not enforced when we're talking about the control of people and or objects that cross the railway? In terms of truck movement operational leadership, given the railway crossing design state and that it carried trains at 90 miles an hour, why was the truck permitted to use the crossing? Did the truck operator even recognise that risk or not? And again, they may well have identified it. They may well have been managing it. You know, like I said earlier on, perhaps the driver, and I'm postulating here, but let's entertain myself for a second. Maybe the truck driver management said, hey, drivers, here's the schedule for trains across that crossing. And they were to know no better that this train was delayed and would be there at this critical time. Railway crossing responsible party. Why was the railway crossing design state such that road vehicles and especially trucks were permitted to use the crossing? You know, what coordination, if any, took place between the railway crossing responsible party and the truck operator? So let's talk about train movement operational leadership, or Amtrak. So here's the control structure you saw earlier on. Just discount these grey boxes here. This is the BNSF dispatcher and the equipment on the train, positive train control system, and the event data recorder. Just included those just to highlight, you know, when you're building your control structure models, you might have an incident that's similar to this, but train side or signal inside issues contributed. So, you know, you can include those. This is how you do it. But in terms of Amtrak, the operator, you know, we've got their decision making and we've got their beliefs. You know, how did they contribute to the accident? So in terms of safety related roles and responsibilities, they have a responsibility to control the train movement by providing the train driver, the engineer, with appropriate limits or procedures. They need to monitor and resolve any potential train or driver issues. They need to monitor for and resolve potential track obstructions. And then, of course, stop the train movement when track is obstructed. Now, there were no sort of issues reported with their ability to control or feedback things. But again, I wouldn't necessarily expect that because the investigators didn't use stamp or cast. But in the future, if you're using this for your investigations, you might make recommendations to look at those things and ask questions about it and collect evidence about it. Now, in terms of contributory control actions, I've postulated that the train movement operational leadership permitted the train to run at 90 miles an hour along a track section with a non-standard crossing that carried truck traffic. Now, that is just a postulated contributory control action. I don't know the detail, but you know, the train was moving at 90 miles an hour. Why was that considered appropriate for this type of stretch of track? Is that something that's even been considered before? I'd argue it probably has, you know, but has that been considered in the context of the crossing being used in truck traffic? You know, these are the kind of things you can really think about. So there's some potential recommendations there. So the railway train operators are to survey all train routes and identify non-standard problematic crossing points and adjust operational speed limits appropriately. And I appreciate that might be a difficult thing to do for various commercial reasons, but, you know, bear with me. Potential recommendation, railway train operators to coordinate with railway crossing responsible party to identify and resolve non-standard problematic crossing points appropriately. And then, of course, the railway train operators to coordinate truck movements with the truck operators. So, for example, if you imagine that the truck operator and the train operators were in communication with each other, the train operator, you know, in the future could let the truck operator know, hey, this train's been delayed by 90 minutes, so please, you know, coordinate with the truck movements that this train is going to come through. I don't know if that is particularly practicable, but I'm just trying to give you some food for thought. And then in terms of why, how, reasons, explanation, I can't provide anything because there's nothing in the investigation report. And then in terms of a summary, again, it's unclear because the investigation report doesn't address it, and it would not normally be expected to consider this given the investigators didn't use stamp or cast. So again, questions and recommendations, I'd say these are the same for the train driver, the engineer. So let's now talk about railway design, build, maintenance and change organisation with a question mark, because I don't know the details of it. It's not really clear to me in the investigation report who is responsible for the design of the railway and the crossings and the decisions behind maintenance and change of those crossings. So I've included those in the control structure in the top right hand corner, as you can see, just purple with dotted lines, because I just don't really know any detail. And of course, I'm coming at this through the lens of as a British person with some level of railway experience, not in the context of the American railway system, the railroad system. But the whistle board, its location, its maintenance, making sure that it's not covered up by overgrown trees and plants and things, or it's been graffitied on. The crossbucks and stop signs, why were they sited the way that they were? Why was it not an active crossing? Why was not information provided to the people using the crossing? The design of the crossing and the grade, the visibility of things, the presence of trees near the whistle board. Which organisation is responsible for that? It's not really clear to me. So just to sort of highlight some safety related roles and responsibilities. So they need to control the track crossing design by providing appropriate designs instructions to engineers, installing, maintaining railway infrastructure, layout, line side equipment, crossing design, etc. Monitor and resolve potential track crossing issues. So were they aware that this was a bit of a hot spot, perhaps, a bit of a risk? Are they aware of other sites, crossings that present similar risks of collisions? Monitor for and resolve potential track obstructions. Stop train movement when track crossing issues exist or track is obstructed. And perhaps maybe it's not stop train movement, maybe it's restrict, slow down train movement, something like that. In terms of control and feedback ability, actuators, sensors and any failures with those, we don't know any. There were no issues reported in the official investigation report, and we don't really know, we can't really expect the investigators to find those things because they haven't used stamp or cast. So, again, it's not clear. Contributory control actions. So I've highlighted a few postulated ones, and that is that the railway design, build, maintenance and change organisation, whoever they are, provided a non-standardised crossing that carried truck traffic. And then the second one is the same organisation provided a crossing that was difficult for truck traffic to cross safely, and then again did not provide information regarding train movement, speed, timing to crossing traffic. Now again, I'm postulating those things. I'm making an assertion that, given that we know that the truck driver has a belief about the movement of trains, a belief about the crossing, what reasonably could a railway design, build, maintenance and change organisation provide to that controller to enable them to behave safely, to be able to make good decisions? And let's say they had a signboard, and I think I mentioned this earlier, that says, be mindful that this crossing has trains at 90 miles per hour. So if you see one, it's going to be on you quicker than you realise. Because not everybody realises the speed of these things and how, the judgment of speed is distorted by how fast they are and how far they are away. And of course, why, how, reasons, explanation, I don't know. It's not in the investigation report. I can't really comment without, making something up. So the summary role of that control in the accident, again, it's unclear given the investigation report doesn't address it, and I wouldn't expect them to because they haven't used stamp. But as prior questions 1, 3, 5 and 7, in addition to that question, the railway crossing responsible party, why was this crossing design physical state as it was, and why was it not apparently recognised as a potential contributor to a hazard? I mean, it may have been, but the investigation doesn't talk about that. So there's a question we could ask if we were doing the investigation using CAST. Now let's talk about regulations and other organisations. So I've just added those, around the top so you can see federal regulations. There are, the US Department of Transportation, the Federal Railroad Administration, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. I don't really know how they all fit into this. That's why there's these arrows, purple arrows with dotted lines. I don't know the detail. It's not clear. It doesn't seem to have been explored as part of the investigation, but let's talk about it. So zooming in, looking at the federal regulations, then let's go even closer. So this one on the left-hand side is the automotive or railroad crossings at grade. So this specifies requirements for the grades of those crossings. I don't know how that, or if that, found its way into the design of that grade, that crossing, or whether it got to the person or organisation that's responsible for that crossing, and for some reason unspecified, unexplored, they decided not to do it. I don't know the details. That's a question we should look at. Railway crossing design standards. They are mentioned and discussed. We know that it was a non-standard railway crossing. Why was that? Why was that accepted? Why was that risk accepted? Who accepted it? What basis? What did they believe to be true that meant that what they did was a reasonably justifiable decision? If it was, I'm trying to be reasonable here. Of course there might be mistakes made and things like that, but let's give people the benefit of the doubt and try and understand that and explore that. In terms of federal regulations, you've got CFR 49, so 213.9, operating speeds, freight trains up to 80 miles an hour, passenger trains up to 90 miles an hour. So they are, in terms of this particular accident, the train operator was perfectly within the regulations to operate up to 90 miles an hour. Now, is that appropriate across the entire rail network? I don't know. Is that something that should be explored? Are there certain categories of tracks with certain layouts that shouldn't be allowed to go up to 90 miles per hour? Don't know. That's an exploration question. Treble 2.21a, on approach to public highway railroad grade crossing, you need to sound the horn 4 times. The railway engineer, train driver did that, so that's great. Treble 2.21b2, before entering crossing, sound the horn upwards of 15 seconds, but less than 20 seconds before the crossing. So that's a constraint on when you can actually blow the horn. Now again, that the background of that requirement might be about operating the horn, a very loud horn, in proximity to people's homes and businesses. It might be that it's appropriate in the context of that part of the rail infrastructure, but is that really appropriate for this wide open stretch with this unprotected crossing? I don't know. Maybe that's a question. Maybe the regulations need to evolve. CFR 49 treble 2.21b3. So at speeds in excess of 60 miles an hour, the sound of the horn should not be done more than quarter of a mile from the crossing. And that's even if the time is less than 15 seconds. Now, I've highlighted this one specifically because it's very relevant to this one. Assuming that sounding the horn is going to make a difference, because it might be that that's a completely ineffective, requirement anyway for this particular crossing. So, but argumentatively, is that really an appropriate requirement for this type of railway, this type of configuration? I'd argue it's probably not. Less than 15, 400 metres, I think it was, quarter of a mile in 10 seconds at 90 miles an hour. That means that the first opportunity for the driver of the truck to hear the horn, if, sound travelling at, the speed of sound across that distance, is it actually going to get to their ears and for them to detect it and for it to update their mental model so that they've got sufficient time to either stop what they're doing or try and clear the track? Maybe it'll make things worse, I don't know, but there's a few questions there. And then finally, treble 229.129 locomotive horns minimum sound level. Again, that's a great requirement, but I don't know if that's appropriate for this particular situation. Maybe it's a bit of a red herring. So yeah, from a requirements and control actions perspective, I can't really talk about it. There's not enough information. I don't know enough myself. I'm not competent in that field. Perhaps you are. You could comment about it. And then again, why? Can't really talk about it. In summary, again, it's unclear given the investigation report doesn't address it, and I would not normally be expected to consider this given the investigators didn't use stamp or cast. Now, there is a question there. A potential recommendation. Perhaps the investigators should use stamp and cast in the future to empower their investigations. So let's now talk about structure analysis, control structure analysis. So here's the overview of the entire thing. You'll notice there are quite a few question marks and dotted purple lines just to highlight we don't know anything about that bit. Just that first observation should show you that if you have a past investigation that you're looking at or a particular case study that you're interested in, when you've built a control structure based on the information that's available and you see these gaps, these questions, you can see that your jigsaw puzzle is incomplete. There are bits missing, and you can make decisions. Should I go and investigate that particular area? Is it relevant? Is it showing there's potential contributory control actions in that area that I need to look at? In this particular case, it's not clear who or what is in control of the design of that particular junction and why decisions were made to allow trains to operate at up to 90 miles an hour on that stretch with that potential risk of trucks driving across the crossing. There was no apparent investigation into the design of that crossing and why this had not already been picked up and appropriately dealt with. Again, I'm sort of postulating because I don't know what's gone on behind closed doors. And, I've looked at the investigation report. I haven't dug through the NTSB docket folder with all of the other information in there. I've seen a few news reports. I've seen a few NTSB reports. But again, they don't really go into that level of detail, nor would I expect them to, because we are using stamp and cast and the concept of a control structure and control loops to help drive our exploration of the reasons this accident occurred. Now, just broadly talking about the 6 broad areas that the structure analysis covers. So, from a structure and architecture and interactions perspective, we could argue that there's no clear relationship between the rail regulations and how the railway was designed, how the crossing was designed, and how the train was operated. There's no clear sort of link between the actual operation of road transport, the trucks themselves. Is there any related regulations associated with that? If so, is that something that we should have looked at as part of the investigation? There's no sort of clear interaction at this level between the train operator and the truck operator. Now, I'm not saying that there definitely should be, but that might be a way in the future to improve the safety of this control structure. In terms of communication and coordination, same sort of thing. There was no discussion about whether there was any communication and coordination between the truck operators and the train operators, even if it's just a feedback loop from the train operation control structure and the truck operation control structure. And as I highlighted and postulated earlier on, if the train operator had provided a train timing diagram or train timing list or whatever you want to call it, that information may have been used or could have been used by the truck operators to help them make decisions about when they want to move trucks across the crossing. But again, if there's any change to that schedule, that's the word, schedule, train schedule, then how would the truck operator know that and be able to do something about it? So there are questions that we could explore there. Dynamics and changes, evolution over time. So this, railway crossing not been designed to a standard, recognised standards that were discussed earlier on. It perhaps is that this train crossing has been like this for 100 years or however long it is, and they've never had any incidents. It may be that the railway operator knew that this was a potentially sensitive crossing, but made a decision, a risk assessment, that they weren't going to act on it because they didn't think it was appropriate. So again, well, why was that? Let's have a look at that. If the crossing is not to any standards, and that was okay back in the day, whenever that was, and then these new standards came along, what change risk assessment was done? Was there any cost-benefit analysis done, for example? In terms of safety management systems, so this SMS is a very sort of broad label, and it means both the formal safety management system that some organisations will have, and I recognise that's a term that's used in civil air transport a lot, and it may not be used in railways in the US, I don't know. But there's the formal safety management system of identifying hazards, doing risk assessments and making sure they're properly controlled and mitigated. Was this particular topic of this crossing and the potential for truck traffic interacting with high-speed trains? When I say high speed, I just mean 90 miles an hour, not necessarily the formal. I think there might be a formal terminology for high-speed train above 100 miles an hour or something. Just forget that for a minute. Trains that are moving fast, that are big trains and that are going to interact with trucks, has that been recognised by somebody? Was it recognised by the train operator or the railway crossing operators as a risk on their safety management system, on their risk list, so to speak? Was it identified by the truck driver or the truck operational controller, the MS Contracting Limited, LLC? Was there any formal assessment or decision making or cost benefit analysis? Safety information system, again, SIS sounds like a really formal sort of thing. It could literally just be somebody's got a list of these crossings on a particular route and that they're monitoring for incidents or near misses. Maybe this crossing had lots of near misses, but they hadn't yet committed to spending money to fix the crossing and make it safer. Or maybe they had done and they had yet to do it. It was just the lag time between, yes, we're going to do it, we're committed, and actually carrying out the work. Safety culture. This was not discussed at all in the investigation report, but there may be cultural issues. The truck driver, and I don't know this, I'm postulating here, but for argument's sake, maybe there was a culture of, you need to get this job done as quickly as possible. And so they were rushing to get it done. Maybe there's an aspect there. I don't know, I'm just postulating, but these are the kind of topics that you could look at as part of that structure analysis. And it may be that different parts of the structure, if we're talking about safety culture, maybe there's different cultures with regards to safety at different layers in this organisation, in this control structure. Okay, so that's sort of the end of the case study, if you like. Just some very broad conclusions and observations, because it is a relatively straightforward accident without too much information in the investigation report, but I'm hoping you can see that STAMP would really help to supercharge that investigation. Working through the CAST process, and especially considering the control loops and control structures, it really helps to drive out questions which would not naturally come to mind. And it helps to uncover avenues for exploration, so you can make decisions as an investigator on where you want to take the investigation. It really helps with that. And of course, STAMP CAST presents a significant opportunity to supercharge your investigations and make powerful recommendations. So just some reflections and questions. So how could you see this helping you in what you do, in the investigations you've got, or in making recommendations for the future? What benefits can you see? What challenges can you see? What support do you require? Do you need some training? Do you need some coaching, some facilitation support, some consulting, or even independent review? Either as an individual, you're an individual trying to use CAST, use STPA in your organisation, on your own terms, perhaps contraband, so to speak, or are you working as part of an organisation that has time and budget dedicated to actually improve your investigations and improve safety? What other questions and comments do you have? If you have any questions and comments about this, please get in touch with me or comment below. I'd really like to hear what you think, what challenges you've got. And then, of course, how can I possibly help? So you're welcome to reach out to me at that email address there or at my website. You're welcome to send me a message on LinkedIn and connect. And of course, subscribe to my YouTube channel, watch my videos on YouTube. And, please, if you like the video, please leave a like, because that helps with the algorithm and all that great stuff. And of course, please leave a comment. Let me know how you're getting on, what questions and comments you've got. And of course, subscribe. The more subscribers I have, the more people that I can reach, the more people I can help. And of course, that makes everybody safer. So thank you very much for watching. And I look forward to reading your comments and see you on the next video. Take care.